This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, brought to you by the Israel Institute, enhancing the study and knowledge of modern Israel. I'm Dahlia Shenlin.
And I'm Gilad Halpern, and every week we talk about books and research and other things that have caught our attention. Before we start, we'd like to introduce a cool new feature. Our guests and topics often spark interesting discussions online, but these are scattered around Facebook, Twitter, and direct emails to us. Now we're creating a special Patreon post for each episode where you can ask follow-up questions or discuss the topics with other listeners. We will link to the post directly in each episode's show notes. Just find where your podcast app puts the show notes, click the link, and you'll get directly to the post. Dahlia and I will review the comments and address the most interesting ones in the following episode.
The truly interesting
ones. And I'm
so
sure there
are
many, yeah. You don't have to be a supporter of the show to join the discussion, though we certainly encourage that. Just go to patreon.com/Tel Aviv Review. Our guest today is a scholar of folklore and folk life, currently working as a guide for the Society for the Protection of Nature in Israel. She is the author of a new book entitled Overlooking the Border, Narratives of Divided Jerusalem. It was published earlier this year in English by Wayne State University Press, and it is based on her doctoral dissertation at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Dana Hercbergs, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you very much.
So Jerusalem is so often examined by historians, politicians, scholars of religion and archaeologists and many other scholars and intellectuals. As an anthropologist, what is the question you were trying to answer about Jerusalem in this book?
Okay, thank you for that distinction. And I should just clarify that I'm a folklorist, and folklorists are kind of relatives to anthropology. Our focus is a little bit different. And as a folklorist, I'm interested in the narratives that make up the identity of a group, how a person conceives themselves as part of that group. So I was really interested in how people understand themselves as Jerusalemites and what stories they tell about themselves and about the other. I was interviewing Palestinians and Israelis in order to sort of establish themselves as Jerusalemites, as natives, and the identity claims that go along with those stories. And I really actually started with children's games. As a graduate student, I was exposed to the field of folklore that I didn't know existed. And there was a program that linked Israeli and Arab children in schools through traditional games, through baking, through pickles. And this program...
Pickle diplomacy. It's called pickle diplomacy.
And it really brought together both schools and the generations above the children.
When was that?
This was around 2004, 2005.
Oh, so things
really
politically
at a very
went
difficult time. Yeah. Let me ask you a question about this construction of narratives about the Jerusalemites. Is there anything like a cross-cutting Jerusalemite identity shared by Jewish, Israelis, and Palestinians alike? Or is it always Jerusalemite in the overarching context of I'm an Israeli or I'm a Palestinian? And you can answer for any time in history that you've studied.
It's a really big question. I don't know that I can even begin to answer it. I think that from my experience listening to public storytelling sessions and interviewing people, the story of what it means to be a Jerusalemite was something that emerged out of the discourse. It wasn't necessarily the overarching question that I came with. I will say that there are patterns, and in folklore, we look for patterns in speech.
What are some of those patterns?
So some of them have to do with, for instance, among Jewish residents of Jerusalem, the number 7 is a formulaic number. And I've heard people say my family has been here for 7 generations. That is a common trope to establish rootedness in the land. And it's also interesting to find it among Jews of Middle Eastern descent who, in a way, harnessed the rootedness, the trope of rootedness, to say, we've been here as long as the Palestinians, or we have also claims to longevity in the city. So stories about arriving to Jerusalem from Yemen, for instance, or Sephardi Jews whose families have been there for a long time. So those are examples of kind of establishing I'm a Jerusalemite, but they're very much linked to that particular ethnic group.
Which is about contrasting. I mean, you think you've been here a long time. I've been here a long time too. So maybe even the identity of being a Jerusalemite is an assertion of my identity versus your identity. Is that what you found?
I think that oftentimes those conversations had in mind the other side as this kind of interlocutor who's not present. And I felt like I was in a way mediating that conversation, even when the other wasn't present.
The book came out in English and is clearly targeting an international readership that may be not that familiar with the intricacies of, the conflict of Jerusalem, being one of the most complicated places on earth. Even when I read the book, I found that, many of the themes that emerge are somewhat to a degree familiar to me as someone who's lived here for a long time and followed the situation pretty closely. Was your quest at the outset to discover new things, or maybe to systematize, in a way, arrange in a clearly orderly manner, all these things all these claims, all these narratives that we hear around us so often and so intensively?
Right. So I actually was interested to see if there was some current of nostalgia on both sides of the border dividing Jerusalem between 1948 and 1967. It started with listening to Arab residents of Ain Rafah, a village outside of Jerusalem, talking about what the landscape was like when they were little and the traditional games that they played. And I thought, I wonder what this landscape of childhood was like, and were there games that Jewish and Palestinian Arab children played? Is there a shared sense of nostalgia for that landscape? And in folklore, oftentimes what happens in social research in general, you start with this particular question or spark of interest, and it leads you to wider issues and to undercurrents that are there in the narratives. So one man I interviewed about this game called Five Stones, he told me, what I'm really talking to you about is relations between Jews and Arabs. And that was important for him to explain when he talked about his childhood. So the games were an entry point to something wider, to a world that is no longer the same. And it was important to reconstitute that world for people. So when I began to interview, I started seeing that there are different kinds of narratives. There are personal childhood narratives. There are museum narratives. There are public tours that are given by organizations like Yad Ben-Tzvi Institute and the Center for Jerusalem Studies in East Jerusalem. And then there are architectural schemes all over the city that also tell a narrative. So I was trying to kind of get a hold of what are the different stories in Jerusalem that individuals tell and that organizations tell, and also kind of the larger physical, political shaping of that entire atmosphere where these conversations were taking place.
I'd be curious to go to focus on that period between 1948 and 1967 when the city was divided. I found it poignant that during the same phase of the same experience of a divided city, the two sides remembered things in a way quite differently. I mean, the Israelis recall kind of a charming, intimate, small city, even though that went against the national narrative of, oh, how sad it is that we're divided. Whereas the Palestinians, this is a bit of a stretch, but they were supposed to, at least they should have been, satisfied with a greater sense, the social fabric was not yet torn up between the West Bank and Jerusalem. They were connected, but they, you describe, had a huge sense of sadness. So two things, I guess, interest me, and you can expand on them. One is they were going through such different things, the Jews and the Palestinians, and both of them seemed to go against the collective national narrative that they were trying to build. I'm not sure what my question is, but can you elaborate on those?
I really think you touched on something important, which is that collective narratives don't always dovetail with the wider social narratives. And that's one of the reasons I think it was really important for me to kind of tease out those differences and to give voice to alternative voices in Jerusalem, to kind of the wider national narratives. So you mentioned truly that Jerusalem was described by Jewish Israelis living in West Jerusalem as this intimate, small town feel that had some magic to it. It was a small university town. The winter seemed colder. Everything seemed a little bit more...
It probably was colder before global warming.
Yes, also. And so the remembering of childhood as a magical time, the very ability to experience nostalgia for that time is in a way a luxury that Israeli Jews experience in Jerusalem from the point of view of having a relatively stable present.
With the occasional sniper fire?
Right, exactly. So it's not easy to point to that, right? And coming from the outside, I grew up in Israel and I left when I was 11. And coming back, I'm kind of noticing this larger master narrative that cradles the smaller narrative. So the master narrative of 1967, this euphoria, Jerusalem is ours, that sense of security, in a way, enables a local narrative to kind of push back against it, or not even necessarily push back, but to say there's a nuance here. We are more open, perhaps, to other ideas of possibility because we experienced scarcity. Some of the people I interviewed described what it was like to move into homes of Palestinians in West Jerusalem after being refugees, moving from East Jerusalem in the Old City to areas like Katamon and Talbiya in the German colony. I feel like I'm kind of moving away from your question.
That's
so
okay.
I want to kind of go back because you asked about the differences between the local narrative and the national narrative.
Or I'm not sure if I would say local narrative or the personal experience of people as opposed to the big sort of top-down national narrative that we're supposed to remember.
So I want to address kind of how Israelis and how Palestinians describe these narratives or describe their experiences. I'll give an example. Madeleine, a woman who lives in Musrara, a neighborhood that is kind of at the heart of Jerusalem and at the heart of the book. A Jewish woman of Moroccan background. She came to Jerusalem when she was very young with her parents. Her brother, Reuven Abergel, was very active in the Black Panther movement, and he's interviewed in the book as well. So Madeleine remembers the 1967 war. She remembers going to the Old City, and she remembers the sense of a miracle having survived the battle. So the sense of a miracle is described in the book, and it's also widely known as a trope of the 1967 war. But her miracle was having survived, having lived in a very difficult, impoverished neighborhood, experiencing marginalization. And she also talked about a tree that was cut down in her neighborhood when the bulldozers came to kind of erase the dividing line between East and West Jerusalem. So, there is quite an ambivalence there. So that is something that was able to come to the surface. I don't even think I wrote down. I don't even think I recorded her, but I didn't put that in the book. But I remember that she was talking about kind of this duality in her experience of the 1967 war. And she still talks about, on the one hand, her desire to meet Palestinian Arabs after 1967, going to the Old City, making friends with Palestinians. And on the other hand, her fear after the First Intifada of going into the Old City. So there's this ambivalence that's there.
Yeah, this ambivalence is something that I want to spend some more time on. And I think that the division between, describing the city as a divided city between 48 and 67 and after 67 really serves that purpose. Because for me, the most significant takeaway is that Jerusalem always has been in a way, and forever will be in limbo. It's one city, even when it was divided, and it's two cities or more, even when it's supposedly reunited. Like there's never, even though in the national narrative, in a way, there is like a clear-cut separation between the two periods, in the mindset of the people that you talk to, it's always a bit of both.
Yeah, but I feel like I'm not able to answer your question yet until because I haven't spoken about how Palestinians experienced that period between 1948 and 1967. So I will say that my experience of speaking with Palestinians in Jerusalem about their childhood between 48 and 67 is kind of this gray period. And the sadness that you refer to was described by anthropologist Ali Klebo as huzun, which is the sadness, this sense of being part of, on the one hand, the wider Arab world, and being able to travel to the Palestinian villages in the West Bank where his family had relationships, had ties, had land, and had homes. And on the other hand, living very close to the physical border that divided East and West Jerusalem along what is now Road Number 1, and coming up against that. And he remembers driving with his family in a car nearby Latrun, and his parents saying, you see on the other side over there, that's Palestine. The sea is beyond that. So from the point of view of the present, knowing that there have been further losses and dispossessions, that period is kind of sandwiched between this nostalgic period of pre-67 and the Nakba, the destruction of 48. So it is also an ambivalent period. It is not
and in hindsight, in a weird way, we know that what they had then is sort of better than what they have now, because now they're really cut off from one another, but not as good as what they recall in the nostalgia from pre-48, right? And that's why you call it the silver, or they call it the silver period.
Right, I kind of called it the silver period.
Did you call it that, or they called it that?
I called it that because the pre-48 past, as depicted in stories and in paintings, appears as this golden age, as this fallen kind of paradise. And I think what the people I interviewed inherited was a sense of their parents' loss. And so something physically and emotionally sits there that does not enable the Hebrew word is hitrapkut, kind of bask in or allow that experience to wash over you and to fully experience it. There was something about the Nakba that curtailed the ability to identify childhood as this fully positive time. And therefore, that ambivalence is very much part of their lives.
You are, as you said, an Israeli, and as we have established by now, as you said, you grew up in Israel up to the age of 11, then left and came back, but you're still Israeli. How difficult was it? And you address it in the book, so I'm asking you to repeat what you've written and maybe elaborate on it a bit. How do you neutralize, I mean, it's never fully possible, but to the extent that you would have access in a similar manner to your Israeli interviews who come from the same peer group as you and your Palestinians who are supposedly from the enemy and treat you as a member of the enemy group?
It's a really nice question because I was really surprised by how open Palestinians were to have me come into their homes and to allow me to interview them. I think for many people, it was really important for somebody from the other side to listen to them. And many people told me, tell your people, tell Americans our story. So I think listening without judgment was key to that rapport. I think that in any conflict, the side that feels that is more marginalized has a great need to be listened to and respected and not be questioned. And my personality wasn't, I came to study folklore. I didn't study political science, although I was interested in political science. I just felt like my job here is to listen.
Hey, political scientists know how to listen to.
This is another interesting thing that you say in the book is that I was really taken by that, is that ethnography is not only an observational tool or a critical tool, it also has an active role to play by opening up what you call, and perhaps others call, a third space between the two realms that you cover. Can you elaborate on that? I mean, what it means really?
Right. Yes. So every interaction creates this space between us, between two or more people. And there's something that's created there that isn't like any other interaction. The third spaces in Jerusalem were both kind of a product of these encounters, and they're also spatially enabled. So, for example, places like the YMCA or these large Christian institutions or hotels, these are places where you see a lot of internationals meet, where you see Palestinians and Israelis meet. And they're kind of these neutral spaces that enable people to come and not feel like they are defensive or that they are uncomfortable, because many of the spaces in Jerusalem are very kind of bifurcated.
So you mean actual physical spaces, not discursive spaces?
Also. But ultimately, I will just say also that Palestinians' hospitality, which is very much part of their culture, enabled them to feel like they're hosting me. And so as a guest, I also had a responsibility to be respectful and to enjoy being a guest and to be human. I wasn't just an interviewer.
Was that an effort for you? I'm just kidding. We think you're human.
No, it's a good question, Dalia.
Okay.
Because I will say that there are a lot of stories in my mind as I'm sitting with people wondering, am I behaving the right way? So there are a lot of things that are unsaid on both sides, and ultimately what transpires is kind of there's verbal and nonverbal communication. And Gilad, you also asked about
divisions and reunitedness all at once.
Oh, I think she meant you asked about the limbo thing.
Yeah. I mean, the fact that, no matter what, even when the city is divided, it is one city, and even when it's so-called reunited, it's still divided. It always has been and forever will be, is like what I infer from your book.
I kind of see it as, I tend to see it as this layering. There are historical layers, and then there are layers that people carry around them when they're traveling in the city, when they're speaking about the past and the present. And when I go into Shuafat refugee camp, or when I go to Ramot, the neighborhood of Ramot, which is outside of the Green Line, I get a different sense of what it's like to be here. So I see it as a place with different perspectives, and that as an ethnographer, I'm able to kind of shift and see things from other people's point of view. And I will say that this ethnography, this project, enabled me to meet people that I never would have met otherwise. So in that sense, a third space is not necessarily a place where the narratives meet one another, but they can be together. They can be contained. And so I see this book as holding them together, even if they're not directly in conversation.
Let me ask you a question as somebody who really tried to understand the stories and narratives of the past, right? How people remember and what's the nature of their nostalgia and the direction that it takes is a big part of what you're looking at here. To what extent do you think that people in Jerusalem live day to day, inside these past narratives? Or do you think that by and large, there's a ripeness for people to think about where Jerusalem is going? Socially, politically, but socially, I guess, is really what I'm talking about from the level of people. You were there to explore how people remember the past. And we know that when a folklorist or an ethnographer asks these questions, that people have to generate ideas about the past. But did you get the sense that that's what's on their minds day to day when they go about their business in the city? Are people reliving the past? Are people stuck in the past? Are people constantly longing for the past? Or are they also thinking about, let's just live our lives in the present and think about how to build the future? Can you tell from your conversations, even though you were specifically studying the past?
I can say that the forums, kind of the memory work that happens in storytelling sessions or the meetings between people, these parliaments that I refer to, which are kind of native social meetings between men oftentimes.
Yes, but you have to say it with an Israeli accent, Parlement.
Right, Parlement.
Because that's what it really is, yeah, Parlement.
Right, so you have these individual Parlamentim, and you also have more organized fora like the Jerusalem Parliament, which was a monthly storytelling event that happened. I will say that these places enable that kind of creating that fabric again, reconstituting the past and reconstituting people's sense of community in the past among Jewish Israelis. I would say that for Palestinians, the past is always present. This is what I heard. The 1967 war, the Six-Day War, it's not 6 days, it's still present. So the sense of the past is very much present for people who are, up against checkpoints and demolitions and curfews. I think as people get older, they're more likely to compare the rapid changes that they're experiencing now with what their childhood was like. So older people are writing their memoirs, they're publishing their memoirs independently, many of them, and they see their sense of kind of responsibility to their grandchildren coming into fruition, I think, in these years, in their 70s and 80s.
Now I'd like to ask you a methodological question, perhaps. You started off by saying how folklorists are different from anthropologists. And I'd like to ask you now how, it's something that's really close to my heart, how they're different from journalists. Because as a journalist who has dabbled in social science, I've often avoided ethnography like the plague because, as many people have told me in the past, and I think with a certain degree of justice, journalists are bad ethnographers. What do you have to say about that? Give me a pro tip. How do I transcend what I do as a journalist, which is essentially what you did here?
I mean, we love going around and sticking our microphone in people's faces
Exactly,
and barging into
people,
their lives while they're
hearing their
shopping
stories.
and saying, "Excuse me, can I ask you a question?" In the middle of their day.
Yeah, and also try to generalize it
too.
and put it in some sort of like logical order. What's your added value as a folklorist, as an ethnographer?
I will say that if I could do it again, I would be a journalist.
Aha.
Yeah, I think there's some great satisfaction in learning about a field and not necessarily writing a book about it, but finding the contours and knowing something well enough that you can revisit and see different angles of a place or of an issue. I will say that I've read some good books by journalists. Jerusalem 1913 by Amy Doxer Marcus is one of them. She took a break from the Wall Street Journal, I believe, and came to Jerusalem and did some archival work on this period in Jerusalem's history that she sees as really pivotal to kind of the turning of the conflict turning in the way that it did. I would say that the difference between sticking a microphone in someone's face, as it were, and taking more time to spending more time, it's a sense of kind of placing yourself in the environment. Many ethnographers come for a year or two to a place and then they leave. But there is a sense of having experienced life in a particular place and of even experiencing bodily what it's like to move, like the people I interviewed move, what it's like for them to go on the bus to the other side of the city. So it's kind of a gestation period, a longer gestation period of allowing those experiences to physically be part of my experience.
So essentially, ethnographers are journalists with more time and a degree.
I don't think you need a degree to be an ethnographer. So
you certainly don't need one to be a journalist.
I think that it's really a goldmine of people's lived experience in Jerusalem. I think that's how I would sum up the book, as opposed to the formal national narratives, as opposed to what the Ministry of Education tells each side to think or what the politicians tell each side to think. And I think that's a real contribution.
Exactly. And the resistance of those narratives. I mean, after all these years, still the grand narratives imposed from above haven't completely crushed those that come from below.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
No, I think even its political implications are important for anyone believing in a better future.
So, for the better future, thank you, Dana Hercberg, for being on the show. You've been talking to us about your book, Overlooking the Border, Narratives of Divided Jerusalem. And thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to Georgia Foscarini and Itai Shalem, our producers, and to the Israel Institute for their generous support. Now, a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we'd like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. You just go to the ratings and reviews section, and then you actually have to write one, but it can be anything you like. Supportive, critical, we welcome all kinds. You too can support us by going to our website, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing on our Patreon campaign where we've got gifts and perks for you. Check out our archive. We have over 500 interviews. If you like us, you can also like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast Ideas from Israel. Follow both me and Gilad on Twitter and join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.